After the flood, humanity had a second chance. The earth was clean, the air was fresh, and God's covenant was sealed in the sky. But the human heart, well, that hadn't changed. What happens when people unite without God? What happens when ambition replaces obedience? Tonight we dive into Genesis chapter 11. This isn't just the story of a tall tower. It's the story of pride, power, language, and the very beginning of God's grand rescue plan for the world. We're about to witness humanity rise again and see God step in once more. The whole earth had one language and a common speech. Just imagine that for a moment. No translation barriers, no cultural misunderstandings, pure unity. One people, one voice, one shared vision. As they journeyed from the east, they found a plain in the land of Shinar and settled there. This place was wide, fertile, open, and full of possibility. It was the birthplace of civilization as we know it. But unity is a powerful force, and power without submission to God is dangerous. So they said to one another, "Come, let us make bricks and bake them thoroughly." Then they said, "Come, let us build ourselves a city with a tower that reaches to the heavens, so that we may make a name for ourselves. Otherwise, we will be scattered over the face of the whole earth." Notice something crucial here. They didn't say, "Let us honor God." They said, "Let us make a name for ourselves." This was the first organized rebellion against God after the flood. God had given them a clear command: be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth. But their response was, "Let's stick together, lest we be scattered." They craved control, security, recognition, and fame. They feared losing their power and their unity, so they built upwards. Brick by brick, layer by layer, human ambition rising toward the heavens. This tower wasn't just a feat of architecture. It was an act of defiance. Then verse 5 says something profound. "But the Lord came down to see the city and the tower that the children of men had built." Think about that. They were trying to build their way up to heaven, but heaven had to come down just to inspect their progress. God saw their unity, their shared language, and their collective strength. And he said, "If as one people speaking the same language they have begun to do this, then nothing they plan to do will be impossible for them." Now, this isn't God feeling threatened. This is God acting in mercy. He knew that their unity, without righteousness, would only multiply evil. So God said, "Come, let us go down and there confuse their language, so that they may not understand one another's speech." Notice the phrase, "let us," the same divine counsel language we heard back in Genesis chapter 1. This was a strategic intervention. God wasn't interrupting their project to destroy them, but to redirect the course of human history. Suddenly, words stopped making sense. Simple instructions became meaningless noise. Coordination collapsed into chaos. Builders started arguing, foremen shouted into the confusion, and friends stared at each other as strangers. Language fractured, and their powerful unity dissolved in an instant. The city project came to a grinding halt, and they were scattered across the face of the earth. The very thing they had built the tower to prevent became their reality. The place was named Babel, which sounds like the Hebrew word for confused. From this single point of rebellion, humanity spread out. New languages were born, new nations were formed, and cultures began to diversify. From this moment forward, the world would never be linguistically united again. But here is the deeper, incredible truth. God scattered them physically so that one day he could reunite them spiritually. Thousands of years later, the event of Pentecost in the book of Acts would essentially reverse the curse of Babel, not by erasing languages, but by uniting hearts through the Holy Spirit. The Tower of Babel reveals a timeless truth about the human condition. Pride doesn't just disappear after judgment. The flood washed away the wickedness from the world externally, but pride continued to grow internally in the heart. The tower was humanity's declaration of independence. We don't need God. We can build our own future. We can create our own greatness. But true greatness never, ever comes from self-exaltation. It comes from humble obedience. And this is where the entire story of the Bible pivots. Because while humanity builds upward in pride, God begins building something different. He begins building a covenant, and he starts with one man. After the chaos of Babel, the narrative of Genesis slows down dramatically. The camera zooms in, we move from a story of global rebellion to the story of a single family line. The genealogy traces from Shem to Arphaxad to Salah, Eber, Peleg, Ru, Serug, Nar, and then to Terah. This list isn't just a boring set of names. It's a golden thread of preservation. While the world was fracturing into competing nations, God was carefully preserving a single lineage, the line of promise through which the Redeemer of the world would eventually come. From the chaos of Babel, God narrows his focus. He's showing us that salvation doesn't come through man-made towers. It comes through a divinely initiated covenant. Terah had 3 sons, Abram, Nar, and Haran. Haran died young. Abram married a woman named Sarai, but Sarai was barren. She could not have children. Right away, the promised line appears fragile, even impossible. Terah took his son Abram, his grandson Lot, and his daughter-in-law Sarai, and they set out from Ur of the Chaldeans. Ur was a major city, a center of power, wealth, and idolatry. They were headed for the land of Canaan, but they stopped halfway in a city called Haran, and Terah died there. The journey paused. The promise hadn't even been spoken yet. But something is stirring. God is about to shift his entire strategy from scattering nations to choosing one man. Babel represents humanity's failed effort to reach heaven. Abraham will represent heaven reaching down to humanity. At Babel, the people said, "Let us make a name for ourselves." But in the very next chapter, God will say to Abram, "I will make your name great." Do you see the beautiful contrast? Human self-exaltation always fails, but a divine calling always succeeds. The Tower of Babel was built with bricks and tar. Abraham will walk by faith. The people of Babel tried to prevent being scattered. Abraham will leave everything he knows and willingly go where God sends him. Babel was all about pride. Abraham's story will be all about trust. Genesis 11 answers some of our biggest questions. Why are there so many different languages? Why are there different nations? Why do we struggle so much with unity? It's because our pride divided us, but God's plan was never defeated. From one scattered world, he would raise up one chosen family. Through that family, he would form a nation. Through that nation, he would bring a Messiah. And through that Messiah, he would offer redemption to people from every language, tribe, and nation. The scattering at Babel made the Great Commission necessary, and the miracle of Pentecost showed God's power to reverse the confusion through his Spirit. Babel divided speech. Pentecost united hearts. The Tower of Babel still exists today, not as a physical structure of bricks, but as an attitude of ambition without God. Whenever we say, "I will make my own name great," whenever we build our success without surrendering to him, whenever we chase recognition instead of righteousness, we are building our own little Babel. But the good news is that God still interrupts our pride, not to ruin us, but to rescue us. Sometimes the confusion in our lives is actually his mercy. Sometimes the scattering is for our protection. Sometimes our broken plans are just his divine redirection. Babel shows us that human unity without God can amplify evil, that language shapes our cultures, and that God is sovereign over all of history. Pride always comes before a fall, but God's divine plan can redirect even our rebellion for his purposes. The genealogy shows us that God works through families and that his redemption plan is rooted in actual history. And the introduction of Abram signals a massive shift in the Bible. We move from the universal history of humanity's problem in Genesis 1 to 11 to the redemptive history of God's promise through Abraham in Genesis 12 to 50. This chapter is the hinge upon which the entire Bible turns. The tower fell silent, the languages multiplied, and the people scattered. But God was not finished. While humanity was trying to climb upward, God was preparing to step downward. Through a promise, through a covenant, through a man named Abram. The story isn't really about a tower. It's about a turning point, because out of confusion, God brings a calling. Out of pride, God brings purpose. And from the scattering, God begins the story of salvation. And next time, we will meet the man who walked away from everything he knew to follow the voice of God. Thanks for watching. Be sure to subscribe so you don't miss it.